Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not even that late, am I? Or am I late? How late am I? Oh, 6 minutes late. Sorry about that.
6 minutes. Hey, it happens, man. Could have been worse. Oh man, yeah, it's weird not filming in my office because I'm in my hometown and I had to film. I went through hell for like 3 days trying to situate myself in a way to like set up a green screen to like set my office backdrop behind me, and it was so bad. I tried different sheets. I tried an actual green wall, didn't work. Spent half of today going out looking for the right material to use as a green screen when I'm down here. Could not get my hands on anything. So here I am in front of a closet. I'm here with the highest of quality. So we do have a couple of gentlemen joining us in the chat already. We have Tehillim29 saying, "Good to see you, Dark Knight and Comic Boom." It's good to see you too, man. I feel like it's been a little bit, but granted, we do these every week, so two weeks without the Canadian in the conversation, it feels like a long time.
Oh, that's so nice of you to say. But I have to admit, like the break did me some good. I needed to get caught up at work, and I spent a lot of time in the yard and with the wife and the kid, and every now and then you got to recharge the batteries and just sort of go isolate yourself a little bit. So it was it was all good, but it's good to get back in the groove and argue with you and correct your thinking there, Dark Knight.
Correct my thinking. Oh man, you're coming in with some hot takes. Next thing you're gonna say,
come on.
Next thing you're gonna say something ridiculous again about the Watchmen, and I'm gonna have to put you in your place.
Oh well, it happens.
I don't know. That might have to be the 50th episode of the show, the Watchmen debate, finally, because I'm geared up for that. But we also got our pal Joe's Geek Show saying that he is ready, and is saying we should tear some shit apart, and I 100% agree. So, with that, I think we can jump right into the introduction. Hey guys, welcome to the 44th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host of the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics, whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations. We hit it all. This week, of course, I am rejoined by the man, the myth, the legend, the Canadian Cape Crusader himself, with a Captain Marvel hat. Comic Boom, man, it's good to have you back on.
Great to be here. I'm always humbled by your introduction of me. I feel like I should be a WWE wrestler or something. It's like I feel like I should work out more to live up to just your introduction alone. It's epic. I got to work on my introduction for you when you're on my channel. You deserve much better. I mean, I have to say.
Yes. Listen, I will take premium introductions with zero cost. I just, I try to keep things as entertaining as humanly possible. But we do have a couple of other folks popping into the chat. Let's see. Aaron Jones just says, "How's it going, guys? How's it going, man? Thanks for popping in. It's nice to see a fresh face."
Yeah, I like his icon there. I like the Mary Jane and Spider-Man thing going on. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I like the art style too. I'd be interested to know whose art that is on there. It has like almost like an over, not, I don't want to say an over rendered, but a more rendered Darwin Cook-esque style, which is interesting. Yeah. We also have the Comic Collector. Good on you for securing that name, because I feel like there's got to be at least 50 guys that have tried that on YouTube. But what's going on, man? Thanks for popping in. Joe's Geek Show wants that Watchmen debate, and let it be known that I do too. So
if I didn't know I would cause such a stir by my opinion on Watchmen, but I mean, hey, some things just need to be corrected, man, and your opinion just needed to be held accountable. So
listen, I know the letters L and O are very close to the alphabet, but you're confusing the words opinion and lunacy somehow, and I don't understand it. But we'll keep chugging through a couple of these guys, because we do have a hefty pack starting with us tonight. Taylor Pector, of course, just saying hey in the chat. What's going on?
Taylor, good seeing you, buddy. Or
and of course,
good seeing you, whatever the phrase is.
And of course, the one and only Samoki dude popping in the chat saying what's Samoki up? The How's one and only. Dude? It's good to see you, man. So with everybody, man, thank you everybody for joining us. And with that being said, I think it's about time we get into the topic for today's conversation, which is, of course, if I can find the actual banner and set this up. Oh, baby. Is comic book event hype dead? And so I think the thing that really kind of set this conversation into motion for me is obviously like Marvel and DC constantly finding ways to bolster sales. And there's definitely bodies of audience that love comic book events because of all of the intermingling of their favorite characters, the kind of grandeur of it all. And then there is the population of them that just kind of view them as absolute messes. And for me, it's interesting because, I've been reading comics for less than 10 years, but the more I read comics, ironically, I think the more I dislike events, strictly because most people that get the chance to write an event fail. And even some of the more iconic ones out there, I think, aren't particularly well-written stories, and people remember them because of kind of the bombast of it all. And
Yeah.
it's definitely like comics are definitely a medium that can take advantage of how striking the imagery can be and how it can really implant something in your head, whether or not you want it to be there or not. It's like when Britney Spears came out with like Hit Me Baby One More Time. I don't think anybody liked it, but we all know it. And it's been like 14 years since that song came out. So it goes to show. But for me, I think one of the biggest issues that has kind of led to the downfall of comic book event hype for me personally is that Marvel and DC are just kind of using them as temporary sales spikes and letting anybody who has made a name for themselves take a stab at completely altering their universe or even their multiverse. And that kind of lack of cohesion and their inability to sort of shepherd along an event with a purpose aside from the money is kind of the detriment of the quality. I don't know. You've obviously been reading comic books for a hell of a long time. You were there reading comics. Before we went live, you were talking about how you still have a Crisis on Infinite Earths poster. That is like the granddaddy of them all. So being a veteran comic book reader, how are you now feeling about comic book events, and has it changed since all those years ago?
Well, I think it has changed, and you basically alluded to all of it. I would just structure what you said. I would just break up what you said and just delineate it more, because you mentioned all this already, and that is about a comic book. Is the question: comic book event hype, is it dead? Well, comic book events are not dead at all, and I don't want them to be dead. However, when the comic book publishing companies, when they impose and expand the structure of a story and they add marketing to it and they create the hype, is hype ever going to die? Of course not. Hype is by definition artificial. It can be created. And hype has a negative connotation to it. Let's face it. And at least I think it has a negative connotation, how I'm interpreting it in the title of this topic. But the reality is that some of the best comic book stories have become events. Really in a way, and sometimes I think really good stories suffer because you want to make an event out of it. And can you imagine, I'll use the example of, let's say that you knew, for example, that Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, that you knew that you had an idea that was going to be just as well received as that was. The problem is that if DC agreed with you, it wouldn't be a 4-issue series or a 4-issue series anymore. It wouldn't be 4-issue Prestige. It would be 27 parts taking part in Detective and Batman, and it would probably have 14 offshoots, and there would be like collateral issues in Batgirl, Nightwing. They would create a couple of new series just to expand on it. I mean, the whole thing would be done to death. And that my biggest gripe with the comic book event isn't with the idea of an event itself. It's the idea that, and you and I have said this repeatedly, that it's about the story. And if a story is really good, it doesn't really need hype. It will sell itself. Obviously, you want marketing in there and everything else. But let me tell you, we know this about the comic book community. The speculators are out there. You need to do very little marketing on a good comic book. The speculators they know what's coming out 6 months ahead of time. They do free marketing. They do free advertising for good comics. You got a good writer, you got a good concept, you just leak it to the right person in the spec market. The advertising is there. The hype will be actually genuine hype. And the frustrating aspect is, and you see it now with with I think Marvel Empire, and we got to be careful when we talk about Empire, and even to a lesser extent Death Metal. The pandemic has, through the fault of no one, the pandemic has taken the wind out of some of these things. But I think it's very important to break down. There's so many moving parts to a big event, between the structure, the scope versus the story itself, that we got to be really careful when we put down big events, because I like big events, but when the story is unnecessarily convoluted and it expands on a story that doesn't need to be expanded upon, like, the old expression, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, I think that has a lot to say. And sometimes I think these big events, the story loses something when you try to add so many side stories to it. But that's my opinion.
I totally agree. When you are letting somebody take the reins on a massive, impactful comic book event, they need to be an architect. They need to be someone like a Jeff Johns. They need to be someone like a Jonathan Hickman, because ultimately they need to kind of have an awareness of all of the gears that are turning in this big machine. And a lot of the time, what Marvel and DC have, well, I mean, they're really the only ones that publish comic book events. Because they're the only ones with like enough clout to do it. But the big issue with that is they see somebody who does successful, who either sells really well or is getting pretty great reviews critically, and they will give them an event no matter what the question is. And I've always taken issue with that, because just because somebody can do something in one lane doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it in another. You don't give a musician a pencil and expect them, to draw you a photorealistic portrait. It's just not how it works. And, I do plan on putting out my review of Death Metal, and I think people that follow me know that I did not like it at all. But one of the things that I've been saying a lot about Scott Snyder is, before he went into metal, he was one of my favorite writers in comics, and he's an excellent writer, and he definitely showed his ability to captivate in this very down-to-earth space, something gritty, something that, again, for lack of better terms, is grounded and almost claustrophobic. He kind of really handles the claustrophobia of kind of street level characters really well. And in those isolated incidences, he allows the stakes to kind of blow up in a really good way. And that's why, he's seen so much success with Batman, Detective Comics, Swamp Thing, Witches, American Vampire. But, I said this on another stream before, where I genuinely think the right move would have been letting Scott Snyder shepherd the next generation of Vertigo. He, at no point in his career at all, showed anything in his toolbox that said, this guy would do a kick-ass Justice League. This guy would do a kick-ass Cosmic Story. Is he a kick-ass writer? Yes. But they let him step out of his lane way too quickly, and he lost his footing. And I will die on that hill. He hasn't written a solid story from beginning to end in like 4 years. And the biggest issue is that he's not in an environment where he can thrive. And while I'm very much okay with an artist coming out of their comfort zone, you have to do it in steps. And I made this analogy when I was actually talking to Joe the other day. You don't feed a baby a packed heaping ladle of food. You take little spoonfuls, and you have to control the portion sizes so that the baby can adjust. And if Scott Snyder is the baby, he is literally taking big ass soup ladles and drowning in it. So That's a huge issue for me. They need to be more aware of who they're letting architect these big plans, because it doesn't necessarily mean that those people are better writers. It just means that handling something of that size is in their toolbox. What do you think?
Well, I think your point is well made. I'm not. Your point's well made. I don't know if I'm entirely. This is just conjecture right now when we're talking about Snyder in terms of how much power to give him. Scott Snyder's been very, very blunt in his interviews. In fact, Scott Snyder is such a great guy. I think sometimes he overshares information. He even admits that, and he's very frank about his arguments with Dan Didio and his struggles with DC, and he's very open about the stress and anxiety he suffered and he went through when he was given Batman. He went through a great deal of stress, and he didn't think he was good enough, and he was worried about this, and so your analogy when I know you don't mean it in a derogatory way when you call him a baby. It was just an analogy, but I know what you mean. It's like sort of like you're biting off more than you can chew. Well, he felt that way, and he stood up and he gave us Court of Owls. So I mean, bear in mind, we you'll be the first I know to give him kudos credit for Court of Owls. It's one of your favorite Batman stories, and I will say that I think that maybe Justice League was a little out of his wheelhouse, but I think it's important just to dovetail this back into our discussion about big event hype and big events. I think it's very important that the editorial drama, what goes on behind the scenes, I think has a significant impact on the big event hype, because there's no question that, look, you can't fault Dan Didio for having an opinion and disagreeing with Scott Snyder. Scott Snyder's entitled to his opinion. So's Bendis. So's Grant Morrison. So's Jeff Johns. These are guys that have earned their stripes in different capacities, with different stories, with different iconic events in their own right. And so when they're not getting along, when they're not all seeing eye to eye and they're not all on the same page, I think it does affect the quality of the event that will flow from the editorial fallout. And that's what I think we've seen that at both companies. And while I'm generally happy with Death Metal, the first issue, more so than you are.
Very much so.
I will admit that very clearly you can see some continuity, slight disconnects between all the series that led into it. It's the connections are there, but I can't sit here and tell people that it's a perfect story, that it's not without its flaws, and that it's not a little confusing for new readers. It's not as accessible as I'm sure Snyder, if Snyder had his way, had DC been more, had Doomsday Clock not been delayed, because that bugged Snyder. Had Didio been more, had Didio and Snyder been more on the same page, I really think that this would have been a series that flowed and would probably be flowed a little bit better. But having said that, it is amazing. And just as a quick aside, the number of perfect scores that Death Metal has received. I think a lot of it is a little bit, I don't know how it can get so many 10s. It was a good opening issue, but I sometimes wonder if people are, I think they're starved for an event right now. They're so starved for an event that I think they sort of were throwing out 10s. And this is I'm shocked if you look at the scores for Death Metal. It's literally 10, 10, 10, 9, 9, 9. I gave it a 7.5. I think Weird Science gave it an 8. But in any event, I'm just curious, what score would you give Death Metal, the opening issue?
A generous 4. Here's the thing, man. I am very against looking at things through rose-colored glasses, and that very much seems to be the case. And I put out I think a fairly respectful post the other day about how, I idolize Scott Snyder. He's one of the people that made me want to become a writer. And I studied a lot of his early work in order to kind of build any type of know-how that I might have, whether or not that's a lot or a little, so be it. But I'm not willing to give him a pass for bad work just because I'm fond of him. I mean, if you saw that picture I posted of him when I met him when I was 19, I felt like a giddy little high school girl about to go to prom with the man of her dreams. My legs were shaking. I could barely talk. I literally idolized him, but I'm not willing to look at his work through rose-colored glasses because I know what he's capable of and he's not performing. And my biggest issue is that he has proven, especially in Death Metal, that he is now the exact opposite writer that he was 4 years ago. He's making mistakes in avenues of storytelling that he used to exceed. I mean, it's a mess. Whether or not you want to talk about accessibility, because it's not. For somebody who says that you could just jump right into Death Metal, that's a fucking lie. Let's get that out of the place. But from a technical writing standpoint, and I don't say this lightly, I could have wrote a better fucking event. It might not have been as exciting, but it sure as hell would have made sense.
My friend.
It sure as hell would have made sense. And it's bothersome because I want to like it. I see all this crazy stuff. I see a Grim Reaper Batman and I want to be in so bad. And that's why I read it. I didn't buy it. I read the review copy. I refuse to contribute to a bad book in the direct market. And if I eat my words, so be it. I'll hunt for it later on the aftermarket.
Okay, well, let me hold you accountable to that. Okay, obviously you're not happy with it, but in regard to our topic about big event hype, am I to assume? I think I assume that this is would death metal be a prime example in your mind of big event hype, and more specifically, is big event hype dead at DC in your mind?
I actually don't think big event hype is dead at DC. I think more personally for me, I don't trust Scott Snyder writing these stories anymore. So I went into it kind of already not having high expectations. But to be honest with you, the only reason I did decide to read issue 1, even though I didn't think it was going to be good, was because I was a little bit excited. Like, it looked cool. I knew it was going to be a mess. And I was really hoping he was going to prove me wrong. And he successfully got me hyped for something that I knew was going to be bad. And it had been openly, you guys can check me anywhere, have been saying that I knew this was going to be a mess. And I was excited anyways. So they got me. They definitely got me. But, so I think that there's like definitely a divide, in terms of comic book hype. It is all dependent on who's doing it too. Like, even I know you were talking about the virus and the pandemic kind of blowing the wind out of event sales right now, but I don't think anybody gave a shit about Empire before the pandemic happened. I didn't know anything about it.
Well, I know I didn't, but I want to be fair to my Marvel collector friends. So,
well, I mean, if anybody to be honest, anybody watching the live chat or watching this in post later, comment or throw it down in the chat. Like, did anybody give a shit about Empire even before the pandemic happened? Does anybody give a shit about it now? Because I don't. I could go without it. And like, honestly, the more that I hear about, what is it? Cross of Swords or whatever they're going to call it, the X-Men event, the more I see about it, the less excited I am. Like, 22 parts. Boy, oh boy, do I not care. Do I feel like spending? Because those are probably going to be $4 to $5 a piece, anywhere from 100 and change to like $150. You bet your ass I'm not going near that thing. I'd rather buy it and trade. So I don't know. That's also the skeptic in me, though. As I become more and more of like a grizzled old comic book fan, I definitely find myself becoming less and less interested in the spectacle. And I would rather read a very tight story with a little bit less of a playground to kind of mess around in. Especially as I get older, man. Every time somebody's like, good comics, I was like, you want to talk about Vertigo? Let's talk about Vertigo. And, no new comic book fan cares about Vertigo, but I think it's just also where I am in reading. And there are so many different things that are going to come into how people are going to be processing comic book events. I mean, clearly, I have this comments up on the screen here from the Comic Collector. It says that events don't matter because changes don't stick. I mean, it's comics. So if you want to make that argument, then you'd also have to make the argument that nothing matters in comics because nothing really sticks unless it's Batman and Superman in tights. And that's about it. So I wouldn't go that far, because if the reception is good, 9 times out of 10, someone in editorial will reinforce the aftermath of the event, and make it have a long-term effect. I mean, who's to say, but I'm curious. Boom, what do you feel about the comment that events don't matter because changes don't stick? Are you more like me? Do you disagree?
Well, you know what? I've sounded like you in the past, and that's not an insult, because I rant and rave all the time. I'll give you an example. Every now and then, I don't know what it is, I just love a big event. I have an itch, and a prime example of that was Secret Empire. I wasn't collecting a lot of Marvel at the time, and I made the conscious decision that everybody was hating the idea of Captain America as a Hydra agent. I thought it was an awesome idea. I thought it was. I loved how it was such an outlier thing. I like reading. I love academics who are contrarians, like Christopher Hitchens, who writes a bad article about Mother Teresa and puts down Henry Kissinger. I just like reading contrarian stuff, you know. But so the idea of Secret Empire, I doubled down. I got all the crossovers, and I really doubled down, and I actually enjoyed it. I didn't like the ending, and I can criticize it, and I got right into it, and I learned something more. I learned far more about the Marvel Universe than I ever had in the past. I had a lot of questions. It piqued my interest. I did start collecting some series. I got familiar with artists and creators I didn't know before. And guess what? Right now, that was like in 2017, 3 years later, I'm down to collecting only 4 or 5 Marvel. And I read a lot of preview copies. But anyways, I go through these stages. And here's my hypocrisy. Is that I'm a little bit of a hypocrite when it comes to big events because I bitch about them, and yet I really do like them every now and then, you know?
Again, the big issue for me is that I think that the comic book event space is just overpopulated with nonsense. You know, it's like you get one shake of salt in a field of barely cooked white rice, and that's genuinely how it feels. I wouldn't mind events as frequently as they do them if they were more carefully curated by the right people. Because let's be real, comic book editorial not doing so hot right now at all. I would say Marvel is actually doing a better job than DC editorially, but that's the big issue. Is that we circle around to editorial in almost all of these live streams when it comes to this state of some aspect of the comic book industry. And the big issue is that I don't think we're valuing editors enough. I don't think we're vetting editors enough. I don't think editors are given are like they're not finding a good compromise between their star talent and their editorial. It's either they give the editorial too much power and they shut down good ideas, or editorial lets a big name run rampant because cha-ching, and that's not how it should work. That's an issue. And you know, if you ask me, I think comic book editorial generally just needs an entire revamp, rehaul. Like there needs to be a pretty firm understanding from the creator standpoint, from the editorial standpoint, from everywhere in the publishing office as to what that dynamic should be. And it's clearly always kind of in this oscillating position. You know, it's like when DC was doing well editorially during Rebirth, Marvel was in the shitter. Marvel starting to do well post CB Cebulski coming on. DC has their issues with DiDio, still kind of stumbling to catch their footing. I mean, the issue, I think, and I've become increasingly more apt to making the suggestion, is that I don't think that the monthly format works that well. It makes creators have to compromise. It makes them have to hire artists that aren't going to do a great job but can do it quickly. AKA deceased unkillables, some of the worst art I've seen in a comic book in a long time. And it honestly completely turned me off. I read issues 1 and 2, and I just don't care to read issue 3 because the art is that bad. And writers are forced to make decisions to compromise their story in order to meet these unrealistic deadlines in a format that's already kind of difficult to pace. Aside from the fact that, what about those scenarios when like you have instances, for example, where Peter Tomasi, I feel like, isn't allowed to do anything big because he's constantly having to work under the thumb of the greater DC universe, whoever's on top of the Batman named book. He doesn't get to do what he wants to do, and he's being constrained. And I feel like oftentimes you can tell where the weakest points in that run are with those 1 or 2 issue arcs, because it feels like he had something else he wanted to do, and they said, no, you got to back off and tell this filler story, and then you can go do it, and he never gets to go do what he wants to do. And I see that happening across the board, and I think that's a big issue. I just don't think the monthly format is working very well. It's not very efficient for anybody. It's expensive. I feel like even from a manufacturing standpoint, printing larger books at a time will save them more money, hence they can make more money. I don't know. That's just me, though. Again, I'm kind of becoming like the rebellious older brother of reading comic books. I just feel like comics really need a flame to be lit under their ass in most categories, and I think that that'll also kind of help to reform the event, right? As we're getting back to this central topic, because they'll be able to take the time to do all of the necessary planning, and whether or not the event ends up being for someone like me, at least there will be cohesion. And cohesion is what I'm asking for at the absolute bare minimum.
Well, the problem with, and it's not necessarily a problem, but it's a challenge. The challenge with big comic book events is that generally speaking, they involve more than one character. They usually involve the entire, all the characters of the particular universe. And so I find it funny that probably I'm pretty sure that over the last, if you pick randomly, if you just rattle off 5 random events, I bet you 80% of what you would name off the top of your head started off 5 issues, but ended up being 6 issues or 7. Because, because they always seem to add an issue. Even Dark Death Metal, they added a 7th issue to it. It's always something that's expanding because, as they get more involved in the story and they start doing the side issues, it grows and it expands. And, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's one of those things where sometimes if you have a good idea, it's such a good idea that I'm glad they expand on it. I thought Civil War, the original Civil War, was a fantastic theme. I thought that I thought the character interplay between Tony Stark and Captain America was fantastic. That worked really well, and that really grew, and it really built something in pop culture and even in the movies. Another example would be that I thought worked well, and Taylor Pector mentioned it. You had it on the screen. There was Flashpoint. Flashpoint, while it was a Flash story at heart, it felt like an event when it was coming out, but there was Jeff Johns has made it clear that Flashpoint was not intended to lead to a new 52. Flashpoint was not intended to be a harbinger of a brand new era of DC Comics, but because it was such a well-received story, it's another thing that had an impact, and sometimes it's a double-edged sword. And should big events, if a big event is very successful, part of me feels that they should just let the success. You don't necessarily have to change everything else flowing out of a big event, and yet they have certainly done that. And examples are, I think Final Crisis is an example. Coming out of that was kind of a disaster. Convergence, coming out of Convergence was DCU. That was a disaster. Coming out of Flashpoint was the new 52. That was temporarily successful, but ultimately they lost their heart and soul. It required a rebirth. And this constant rebooting, this tendency to, it's almost like they're addicted. It's like, and I guess I have that addiction too. It's like I said, every 3 or 4 years, I'm looking, oh my God, I haven't had an event this year. I haven't had an event in 3 years. It's like, please, I need my fix. I need my fix. And I'm desperately searching for a comic book company to overwhelm me with plot points.
I don't know. I mean, it could just be where I'm coming from in comics, because my start was very non-traditional. But for me, it's ultimately the story over the grandeur, and I can certainly get excited for a story. I mean, like I said, I was not very optimistic going into Death Metal. Was I still into it? Was I still hyped? Yeah, I did. I did catch the hype train a little bit. But ultimately for me, I'm not excited about an event until I find out a little bit about what it's going to be, who's attached to it, Ultimately, it's a story thing. And whether or not I can trust a creator to make the most out of that situation. There's ultimately, one of the major issues with all of this mishandling of events is just this lack of cohesion, and the machine that is the comic book industry and the publishing line not really being able to get in step. When they're in step, I feel like success is almost seamless. I mean, we go back to DC Rebirth a lot. Highly successful. It's what got me into reading a much wider kind of diversity of characters from DC than I had ever read before. And, they immediately, for some reason, had a real fork in the road thrown in front of them and made a very rapid decline in quality. And you could very much tell that the gears were shifting in not such a great way. And even, with pretty much the time surrounding Bendis, I remember when that was happening, one of the things that kind of slid under the radar was all of this rapid changing of editorial, DC editors going to Boom and to Image and to Dark Horse, taking promotions elsewhere. And I feel like that's got to say something about what the atmosphere was like from the inside, because we don't really ever know what's going on behind closed doors. And there's certainly something to be said about that kind of lack of cohesion and people abusing their position at the top of the ladder.
Yeah. At the end of the day, is comic book event hype dead? I don't think it is. I think the hype is still there because the comic book publishing companies can't get around it. I think it's too much a part of their culture. And but maybe now with AT&T having, apparently the DC is still in an editorial flux. Scott Snyder has said that after Death Metal, it's going to be the end of an era. Those are his words, and we're going to get back to character-based stories, which leads me to believe that we're going to be seeing more fiefdoms, more kingdoms. We're going to be seeing more, I don't know, but I have a feeling we're going to have more Wonder Comics, more Bendis. We're going to have Grant Morrison. We're going to have Snyder. I don't see a lot of cohesion. I've heard rumors through different sources about the state of DC internally right now, and of course it's all speculation and gossip. But I openly wonder if my idea of the next DC event is probably going to be something. It probably will be a one writer show. It's going to be something insular. Like we're going to probably get another 6-issue Leviathan event, or we'll get something from Sean Gordon Murphy in his Batman universe, or we'll maybe get Grant Morrison doing another spin-off of his Green Lantern interpretation. I see that is where things might be going. So I don't predict a lot of, especially in the post-pandemic times. I openly question whether or not I don't see Marvel moving toward big events anymore. I don't see them putting out, once they're this 10 of X, Sword of X, 22 issues is done. Once Empire is done, I think we're going to see a decided change in publishing strategy.
I don't know, man. Marvel, especially over DC, has consistently through their best and worst times been throwing events at us, pretty much, I feel like every 6 months and at times every third of a year. I mean, we're literally getting Empire and Cross of Swords, whatever it's called. They keep coming up with new names to describe the X. Can we just call it X? Please make it easier on us. But we're getting Empire and we're getting that. And the weird thing that gets me about the Cross of Swords or whatever is that the main story is kind of interweaved throughout all of the X books rather than having one event book called, I'm just going to call it X of Swords, whatever the hell you want to call it. Which I find really odd because it's kind of, I feel like it's them dipping their toes back into that kind of 90s style event comic where it wasn't actually a comic named this. It was a storyline that bled through that space in comics, which I actually really don't like. I don't like that at all. It really bothers me when they do that. I would much rather have a story take place in this book, and maybe you have some tie-ins over here, but the main story should be, in a book with the title of the story you're telling, rather than doing issue 1 in Excalibur, issue 2 in X Factor, issue 3 in X. And I know they do that for money, and I know it's a big desperation tactic to sell more books, but boy, that is not my flavor of event comic books. How do you feel about something like that? I mean, I know we have gotten some of comics' greatest events. We got No Man's Land out of a massive crossover that took place in that same format.
Well,
so
it can work, but even No Man's Land at least seemed to have a unifying theme and a unified environment, and it was more or less restricted to Gotham City, and it was generally easy to follow, and each individual comic book tied into No Man's Land in a sense had their own story. And I was going to reference, you just put up Taylor Pector's comments there. Year of the Villain is an example of how not to do an event, because that was a general theme. That was basically throwing shit at a wall, hoping something would stick. And the concept in theory was sound, with Lex Luthor offering to power up or to gift various villains with some extra power or extra money from his financial resources or his epic, genius knowledge. And what a disappointment. It became very, very obvious very early on with Year of the Villain that not a there's a couple of writers that did something decent with it. Venditti did something decent with Hawkman, I thought. And I was mildly interested. In Black Adam or Shazam. I thought maybe there's some potential there. And I thought Sinestro had a decent one shot, but the vast majority, every other villain was there wasn't anything special about it. And it led toward Harley Quinn giving an award to the best villain of the year. It was really badly done. That was just an awful event.
That was one of those weird things where you could tell it editorial was just like, hey, I know you have this story, but can you put the doom signal on the last page of your book in the sky and then have like a hologram Lex Luthor come tell your guy to do the thing they were going to do already? It just
the little doom bots? The little doom bots?
It just felt so unnecessary. I remember reading like Batman and the Outsiders because after my disappointment of Metal and Snyder's Justice League, I was like, I'm getting as far away from the Year of the Villain shit as possible. Did not touch that Hella Risen garbage. None of that shit. And I remember reading Batman and the Outsiders, and it was like the end of like the arc. It was like Ra's al Ghul doing this plan he was going to do already. But like, let's spice it up with a little bit of Lex, a little bit of that Apex salty Lex. And I was like, why? Why is this here? Why does Ra's al Ghul need Lex Luthor? And then it was like in Detective during that Mr. Freeze story, you could already tell he's like, oh, I've developed this nanite that can do this. But Lex Luthor came in and sprinkled a little bit of pixie dust on this bitch, and it works slightly better. All right. Like, come on. Like I said, I didn't even know. That's even what you just told me about Harley Quinn giving out an award at the end of the event. That just made me feel so much more gratified that I didn't go near that shit, because I was like, oh, it's James Tynion, Steve Epting doing this thing. Like, that sounds interesting. And I was just like, if I want, I'll pick it up in a dollar bin in like a year from now. And then I just didn't hear anything about it. I don't remember anybody talking about it except for the kind of vague ramblings about Punchline, which I also don't care about.
Another funny little subplot of the Year of the Villain was the Cheetah in the pages of Justice League. She took some of the Tear of Extinction and she put it on a sword, and she had the Tear of Extinction in Snyder's Justice League. She then ended up in the pages of Wonder Woman, and Lex Luthor sent one of his Doombots to steal the Godkiller sword from Grail while she was fighting Amazons on Paradise Island. Literally removed, sneaks. This little Doombot snuck up and stole the Godkiller sword from Grail, gave it to the Cheetah after the Cheetah had already had this other sword for the longest time, and then Cheetah did the same thing in Wonder Woman that she had done with the previous sword. It was so bad. I think Cheetah was in like 12 or 13 straight issues of Wonder Woman. It felt like it went on forever, and it was just like, oh my God. That was during Jerry Willer Wilson's run too, which didn't help it. Oh, what a painful experience that was.
You know what really astounds me on that? This ties back to the question of comic book event hype being dead. I think we've answered that, right? Like, clearly hype isn't dead, but it astounds me at how high they were able to maintain hype within the fandom and how much garbage they give us, where the fans will still come back to the next event literally excited for no reason whatsoever. Like, they're like, hey, are you guys hyped? We're like, I don't know. And then they're like, oh, but you're hyped. And then comic book readers are like, oh, you're right. I'm hyped. I'm real hyped. And then they buy it, and then it's garbage. And then they complain about it. And then this cycle starts again. It's insane. Really, like I said, who cared about the Hell Arisen stuff? Nobody. You know how they got people back on? They're like, remember this metal thing that like half of you really liked? We're just going to put death in front of it and you're going to love it. And somehow everybody's giving it a 10, which, like, at me if you want, everybody giving it a 10, you're fucking wrong. Your opinion is wrong.
And incidentally, that was one of the editorial battles that Scott Snyder won, because the editor, I think Didio and other editors, they wanted to call it Death Crisis, and he wanted to call it Death Metal.
Oh, because
everything else was called
literally
it was because he wanted to Crisis. He knew Crisis was going to refer to the energy versus the connective energy and the crisis energy, and he didn't want to call it Crisis. He wanted to call it Death Metal. Plus, it related back to the original metal, which was a financial success. And that's one of the reasons why I think that ultimately Snyder won that battle of wits, so to speak.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's be real. Editorial is not in it for quality; they're in it for the monies. And I mean, I ate metal up. I ate metal up like a motherfucker. I have at least 2 copies of every issue of Metal, always an A cover and a variant. I have every single tie-in that came out for it. I stood in line to get my Metal #1 signed by everybody and their mom that was involved. And I was in. I was so in on that book. I think that's why I kind of sound like an upset, like, girlfriend that got dumped. Like, he dumped me pretty fucking hard come issue 6 of Metal, and I just never got over it. But ultimately, you know, you're right. The kind of semantics of calling it Death Metal over Death Crisis or Anti-Crisis or whatever, no doubt that bolstered the sales by a couple thousand, because there were even comic book fans. I remember after Metal came out, there were like normies asking, "Oh, I'm hearing about this Dark Knight Metal thing. How is that? Everybody telling me it's good." I'm like, don't waste your fucking time. But that kind of static that's still present in the air about death metal, I feel like you have people coming into this event that didn't even read Metal. I feel like that audience of people, I mean, we'll see what happens with sales, but that audience of people, I feel like, is making up for those like me who hopped off the Metal train completely. So I'd be interested to see what the sales are going to look like, because as far as it's going to be different too with the 2 different distributors. And I wonder how we're going to be able to measure that. I mean, it's definitely to DC's benefit not to show any losses, to look more competent than they are, but who knows, man. The comic book distribution system has been corrupted by crisis energy.
Well, I do think it's what's interesting about events and what contributes to the hype is if it is related to something that's going on current events. And we could use Secret Empire as an example, and I do think we could use Death Metal as an example, because I do think parallels can be drawn. And I know you and I, we don't like to, you know, we don't actively seek to involve politics in our comic book discussions. We like just keeping it comic books. But I think it is worth noting that notwithstanding your view of death metal, I think that the parallels between death metal and currently what's going on in the world right now, I think those parallels are there if you're looking for them, and if they're there. And I think it's and I think quite clearly Scott Snyder's made it clear in interviews. His politics, I mean, I think it's fair to say that he's probably not Republican. I don't think, and you know, given what's going on in the United States right now, I have to say, and the rest of the world, I'm really looking for a happy ending on this. And I think Snyder's going to give us one. I'll be blunt, man. I need a happy ending so bad. If he wants to kill me, if you want to see the Comic Boom kill himself, you know, give me a bad ending on Death Metal, man. I need a happy ending. I just need a happy ending.
It might be happy. Who's to say it's going to be a good ending? But it might be.
I'll just go for happy, man. I'll just go for happy.
I'm curious. So, what was your tell on politics? The fact that Perpetua is Donald Trump, or the fact that Perpetua is Donald Trump? Like, I mean,
what I find very interesting is you still have the political and cultural divide on various issues in the world, obviously, particularly the U.S. and the idea of crisis energy versus connective energy. and just how, you could probably talk to, people who are, let's say, divided on the issue of race, which is a very hot topic. And depending on what their point of view is, would you describe them as being connective in their energy or contributing toward crisis? And you can really probably argue about that. And the nuance in the story of death metal, I think what makes it fascinating from a thematic point of view and from a mythological point of view is the devil's always in the details, but so's the angel. And what exactly is connective energy versus crisis when you get right down to the nitty gritty? Because sometimes the distinction between good and bad, right and wrong, it's cloudy. It's clouded. And I think that's what makes it such a fascinating story. And I don't think anything is quite black as and white. Wonder Woman is very black and white. Wonder Woman wants to win everything. Batman is in the nuance. Batman just wants to win the skirmishes. He wants to save who you can and deal with the reality on the ground. Wonder Woman is a little bit more mythological. She's about the bigger picture and about saving everyone, and maybe a little bit naive, but yet a better general in my mind. And so I just love that dichotomy that's going on there. And meanwhile, Superman is there powering up the sun that's burnt out, and he's literally the rescuer and the fireman battling the anti-life. The different themes and the way that Snyder's utilizing the Trinity in this and the analogies that you can make to what's going on in the world right now, I think it's quite fascinating, and it would make for a fascinating essay, but I don't know if anybody would read it.
Well, looky here. It is June 19th, the first day of disagreement season. So, by nuance, if you mean Scott Snyder is an old Italian grandma beating you with a wooden spoon every time you try to touch the cookies, then yes. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm very likely to go off on a rant on my own review of this mediocre book. But he is literally screaming theme at you. I mean, I don't think there's any nuance at all. He is literally having characters explicitly tell you what's the central goal of this book. Every story matters. Really? Really? I needed you to tell me that? Seriously? Somebody please meme me right now. I'm giving you so many good opportunities.
He's trying to do Morrison. He's trying to write like Grant Morrison.
Emphasis on trying. He's not Grant Morrison. It doesn't make him a lesser writer. It certainly makes him judgment impaired for trying to be something that he's not, but he's not Grant Morrison. Only Grant Morrison can do Grant Morrison. And that's not saying he's a god. It's just he has a very particular approach to storytelling. That's the issue. Scott Snyder, you look at me, Scott. Start writing like Scott Snyder. Stop writing like Grant Morrison, because you do better writing like Scott Snyder. There's a real problem there. And I also am a little bit offended that I would be, at least, if I was actually a fan of death metal, that Scott Snyder feels the need to literally spoon feed you theme and to tell you what this story means. A good writer should not have to do that. There should be nuance. There should be context clues. Yes, dialogue can be clues, but dialogue should also not legitimately be telling me that the theme of this story is about how everybody's story matters. Please. I mean, I'm not 12. Stop treating me like I'm 12. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm analytical. Maybe it's because I find these things so blatantly fucking obvious that I don't need him to tell me or to beat me over the head with it.
Well, let's be fair. Okay, now I have to defend. I don't know if that's necessarily all attributed to Scott Snyder, because originally the idea of the connective energy being one giant generational story sounds a lot like 5G. You could see the plot threads for 5G within the first issue of Death Metal. Now we know that 5G is dead. We know it's not doing that anymore, but it still has those elements. You can still see where on a drop of a dime they could easily flip it and go into 5G again if they wanted to. The idea of one giant generational story of everything matters, that's really where that came from. And that's also why Scott Snyder, I believe, moved away from the complicated 7 deadly forces and just and he dumbed it down and he just called it connective energy. So it's just one word to remember instead of 7 different forces. And he called it crisis energy instead of ultraviolet core, instead of still force, instead of black, all those other ones. And so he's trying to simplify it for the readership.
But don't you love when you pay for spaghetti and meatballs and you get like a vegetarian spaghetti and zucchini like dish? Like, don't you love it? I love it. I love it when you spend like 40 issues talking to me about these stupid 7 forces that you don't even elaborate upon. And then suddenly it's something entirely different because we got to fucking dig our heels in and pivot hard. It's sloppy. It's so sloppy. Like, you know, he's not one of those writers that can take, I mean, okay, let me rephrase this. The big issue is he's not taking something that has existed throughout continuity and trying to repurpose it. He's repurposing something he did in his own story, part of his own setup for this. Literally, the 7 forces were a thing as of Justice League 39. What? I don't know. Maybe I am just becoming increasingly intolerant of like bullshit, because this is certainly bullshit. I apologize too for those of you that did not come from my death metal rant, but I kind of saw this coming because boy, when I read this at 3 a.m, I was texting everybody. I was like, Joe, Rocky, fucking Mike, even though I don't really know a Mike, let's talk about this. Because there are so many, I don't know, man. There's just so much to say about how we're getting beaten over the head with the messages, how he's turning on his heels to change things that he has set up. It's just sloppy. It's really, really sloppy. And I made this analogy to you in private where I said, death metal is like I ordered a crazy $12 tricked out sundae with all the fixings, and I get there and it is a teaspoon of vanilla ice cream drowning in sprinkles. Hella sprinkles. Sprinkles look cool and colorful. Does it taste like sugar and garbage and more sugar? Yeah, it does. Is that what I paid for? No, it's not. With both my time and my money. I don't know. I mean, it's frustrating. And the crazy thing is, pertaining back to the hype train is full steam ahead on this death metal shit. And it goes to show you that the spectacle and the hype overrides quality of story, which, you know, again, I guess it makes the title of this video very clickbait, because hype for comic book events is very much alive. And I feel like to some degrees, it enables these comic book publishers to do these half-assed, very touch and go curated events with very little cohesion. So yeah, I blame us. I blame the fans for letting them do this and for making it successful. I don't know. I need a nap.
Well, I'm not. You know what? I'm the last person to get in front of another person's rant, and that was an epic rant. Good job. I like it. I like death metal, and I think it's going to go somewhere, and I am convinced it's going to have a happy ending. And I think I like it better than the original metal already. But I have a big bias. I have a huge bias, and I'm a big Wonder Woman fan. And I love that Wonder Woman is kind of standing up to Batman. I love that Scott Snyder has said that Wonder Woman is the hero of this story, or he strongly implied that. I think he expressly said that, but maybe I stand to be corrected on that. But
he did. He did.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I really like what I'm seeing about Wonder Woman. I've complained ad nauseum about the portrayal of Wonder Woman in DC Comics for most of the last 20 years, to be blunt. I actually like her standing up here and kicking some butt, taking names. I love that. I love the fact that she took out the Batman Who Laughs, because I hate the Batman Who Laughs. And even Scott Snyder, he's got a little bit. He knows people are sick of the Batman Who Laughs. That was even an inside joke in the early pages of the comic book itself about, you know, Batman Who Laughs even said that, oh yeah, it's me again, or, you know. And in any event, I think so. Snyder is aware of the criticism that he's received. He's well aware of it. Good Lord, he direct messaged a nobody like me on Twitter when I complained about Justice League 39. So I know that he cares about what fans think, and he does, you know, by his own admission, he does stress about it. But he also respects that not everyone's going to like his work. But I like this, and I'm going to say something that you've said to me more than once, and that is, it's only the first issue of a 7-issue series, so maybe give it some breathing room, my friend.
Well, it's actually like the 76th issue in the same fucking story that hasn't ended since
Wow.
Justice, or no, was it Metal? And then actually Dark Days, those things. Yeah, I mean, he never ended the story. It never finished. It's the same story. Like, that's the issue. If this was an actual issue 1 of a brand new story and a brand new narrative, and I didn't like it, sure, let's give it a try. When we're at issue 7,865 of the same fucking story, sorry, breathing room gone. You're out in the motherfucking middle of space, my man. No way. I think that's the thing that people are forgetting about. They're like, give it a chance. I've given Metal a chance, and all of the millions of tie-ins, and No Justice, and Justice League, and I didn't even give Hell Arisen a chance because I was already out. But like, how many chances do you give somebody? It'd be slightly different if Snyder was able to kindly tightly wrap up subplots, or to make something feel a little bit more weighted in the moment, wrap that up, and scale it to something later.
But let's be clear here that this is not all on Snyder. This story with Flash Forward, the direction of the DC universe, the failure of 5G, that was an editorial. He's part of it. He's partly responsible for it, but this is all of DC is responsible for whatever. If you consider this to be as a mess as you've clearly indicated you think it is, that is, you can't put that all on Snyder. Yes, you can put 39 issues of Justice League on Snyder. Yes, you can. He argued with editorial. Editorial wanted him to give it a happy ending. He fought for Doom to win in issue 39. He's admitted that. So he's on record standing by his story. So he's responsible for some of it, yes, but not, he's not responsible for the delays on Doomsday Clock, which had all kinds of issues. He's not responsible for the substance of Flash Forward. He's not responsible for, he is responsible for the Batman Who Laughs.
And Perpetua and the 12,865 positive forces that he never resolved. Here's the thing, Boom. I would give him more credit if it felt like he was ever going to wrap up his story and it suddenly felt like it wasn't going to end. But at no point has he ever started gearing down to wrap up a story. All of this overarching narrative, let's say we've definitely had over 80 issues worth between the tie-ins and all of the bullshit. But let's give him a nice conservative 80 issues. If you as a writer cannot wrap up a single story in 80 issues, that's on you. That immediately becomes like editorial is absolved. And I think the fact that it's very evident that Snyder is now able to literally swing his dick around and do what he wants to do says that it is him. He has had the agency to do what he's wanted to do with his narrative almost this whole time. Practically this whole time. Even when DiDio was there, he did things in Metal that DiDio did not want. And if a writer is suddenly able to outclout your co-publisher, that says something. And that's where I will not ease up on him, because he's had all this time to finish his story, or at least to make it feel tighter, and it hasn't happened. And it'd be different if we were talking about somebody like Tomasi or Venditti, who is talented, but clearly doesn't have the clout to swing their dick around and tell editorial no. But Scott Snyder has been given the reins to do what he has wanted literally as soon as he finished his Batman run. That was when he got the keys to the castle. When he got Death Metal, or when the original Metal sold, that's literally when he got the keys to the fucking multiverse. So at that point, I refuse to take the blame off of him, because him as a writer, he should know how far out or how much ground a single story can cover. And we have outstretched our welcome for far too long. I want something different. I don't care about this Dark Crisis. I don't care about long fucking 80s hair metal. I don't care about power chords or drum beats or leather jackets or fucking invisible chainsaws. I don't. I want a good story. That's all I want. I want it to wrap up. And here's the thing, Boom. Unlike you, my nitpick of Justice League 39, trust me, there's a lot of nitpicks, wasn't that it ended on a non-happy note. I don't give a shit if a story ends happily, frankly, as long as it's a good story. But it's not a good story. I mean, you pick it apart technically, pick it apart on the basis that he's setting up all of these different things that he never resolves. Because let's be real, Scott Snyder hasn't successfully ended a story in 4 years. Let's be real. Batman Who Laughs didn't end. Death Metal didn't end. All-Star Batman barely ended, maybe, not so much. Justice League didn't end. No Justice didn't end. What else?
Yeah.
What else? I mean,
I can't argue with that. I can't argue with that. I guess at the end of the day, there's enough there that he puts enough into the subplots that he keeps people coming back, and he creates intrigue, and there's always that promise on the horizon that he is very good at doing that, and it does appeal to a lot of people, and it seems to have the effect on me that I'm always there for the journey, and then I always get upset at the destination to realize that we haven't arrived yet. But I enjoy the journey. I enjoy the journey most of the time. Most of the time, I'm enjoying the ride.
I feel like every time we get into one of these, it's like early on, I'm like fuming, and then I drop off, and then like towards the end of the series, then you're fuming, and I'm like, I feel like that like nonchalant dad where like the kid is screaming about something, and I'm just like reading the newspaper. I'm like, I told you so. I mean, and I have a strong feeling that this is how that's going to turn. I mean, maybe not, because I know that you kind of at this point have a hard on for a happy ending. And I feel like if he gives you your happy ending, to be quite frank, I feel like you're sold as long as it's a happy ending at this point. You want it so bad.
Well, here's the thing about comics. A lot of stories will end setting a new status quo. And whenever a story ends, whenever a new status quo or an environment is created at the end of a story, like take, for example, Hickman's House of X and Powers of X. That was a 12-issue series, 6 issues of Powers of X, 6 issues of House X. It was essentially one story, 12 issues, but it never really had an ending. It planted a bunch of seeds, and it posed a lot of questions and never answered them. It just established a status quo, and I'm really interested to see where it goes. But guess what? I just decided I'm not going to stick around for another 7 years while it plays out. And I guess it depends, and that's just the truth of it. Whereas with Snyder, No Justice did have an ending. But it also had something that if you wanted to continue after it, you could. Batman Who Laughs, the 7-issue series, it also had an ending. The main plot itself was over. Batman Who Laughs went off into the wilderness and wasn't caught. I mean, just like how many times has the Joker arc ended with the Joker disappearing, but Batman's defeated him, but the Joker's disappeared. You could argue, well, there's no ending. The bad guy wasn't caught. I mean, you can. So, I mean, there's different types of endings, and the type of ending in comic books where you can't kill a villain anymore because they're popular, you're always going to have a little bit of a non-ending. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that they never had endings.
I mean, so no, there's a difference when you are literally picking up the A plot and continuing to build on it in another series. I mean, No Justice. What was the A plot? Or okay, we'll start with Metal. Metal sets up their A plot. The dark multiverse, crazy forces, they crack the source ball. A plot gets built upon in No Justice garbage. Source wall is broken. We're going to have our own Celestials. They're going to fuck us up a little bit. We're going to come together. Lex is going to get super salty for absolutely no fucking reason and ruin his character development. You're right. Yeah, I was mad about that. So that gets built upon in Justice League, where all of the fucking tree energies and the big bad Celestials, key into the totality. And then that gets spawned into fucking however many bad Justice League stories. And then that gets built upon in death metal.
That actually sounds like a really good story, what you're describing.
Oh,
This is
boy,
exactly why this was no, but you can't say it wasn't interesting. Surely to God, you have to acknowledge that it was an interesting. He was crafting an interesting mythology that pulled people in to come back for more. You can't deny that because you can point to the sales. So I mean, and plus it was a good story, and clearly you read most of it, and you're even fairly good at articulating it, and it actually sounds interesting, even when you're trying to make it sound not interesting.
Well, here's the issue, Rocky, is that you know what sounded really interesting? Having the United States president be a celebrity that had his own TV show. Oh, wait. How good has that been? Interesting, maybe. Productive, no. So, I mean, if we're going to make that argument, sure, death metal was interesting. Is it still 4 out of 10? Yep. There's a fine line between the spectacle and the intrigue and the execution, right? There's something intriguing about the guy that yelled at everybody and told them that they were fired being the president of the United States. What do we have now?
You are filled with crisis energy, my friend, and I am filled with connective energy, and we are going to create an explosion and shut down the internet.
Listen, that's immediately a better story than death metal. Let's do it. Let's do it. I'm here for it, man. I mean, man, I apologize to anybody that didn't want to get my death metal rant, because I honestly, I saw this coming and I've been very passionate about it. But it goes to show you, though, the prevailing longevity of comic book event hype. And I feel like the event hype that really permeates the fan base is entirely dependent on what it's building off of, right? Like Secret Empire, although it was not exactly critically well received, the hype was constantly there because it was built on the final page of Spencer's first issue of Captain America, where he says Hail Hydra. Like, there is an intrigue there, and it's interesting because, you know, as much as I didn't care for Secret Empire, as much as I really don't like death metal, there's a lot of hype there. And I'm indifferent, for example, about Empire, and there's nothing there. So I feel like it's almost a question in and of itself to try to figure out what generates a lasting and a kind of strong hype for a comic book event. Because clearly the big two have events going on now, or events that are going to happen, that have kind of captured the consciousness of the fan base, but also others that don't. So I'm curious, Boom, is there something specific about something like death metal or something like the Cross of Swords that people seem to gravitate towards versus, you know, Empire?
Well, obviously it comes down to theme. And, you know, if you're, you know, all of us who still read comic books, I mean, Bill Mayer might make fun of all of us because we're still reading what he thinks are children's books. And in many ways, we all of us are a bunch of little boys trapped in adult bodies. There's nothing better than a good versus evil book. But you know what? Those themes of the nuances of good versus evil, of right and wrong, of the hero, the anti-hero, the variation of that is something that resonates. And if you can have a different spin on that, you're going to intrigue me. And it's very obvious, especially with death metal, you can see the impact that Grant Morrison has had since Final Crisis. I wasn't a fan of Final Crisis, but that whole idea of breaking the fourth wall, challenging the reader, challenging the medium, nobody who enters the comic, Scott Snyder in particular, really, 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 you get the idea, is passionate, and he's definitely a control freak. He needs to be in complete control. He doesn't like losing any kind of control, and he needs to have things a certain way, and that often can lead to the best writing, and sometimes it can lead to the worst writing. But I will say that to directly answer your question, to me, it comes down to the theme. And there's nothing better. I like stories that make me think, that make me think outside the story. And in particular, what I like about death metal is I really think it's a message that every character in death metal, if you really wanted to reflect on it, is you could find a counterpoint on our Earth, in Earth 33, or we're Earth Prime, right? And I think that counterpoints are there, and I think it really says something. And for me, I'm getting a lot out of the Wonder Woman Batman analogy, and the role that Superman is playing, and that whole idea of, do you just win the small battles in your life, or is it all about the big picture? Is it about who you are individually with individual people, or is it about what you project to everyone? Is it about love, or just your occasional relationships? Is it about your private darkness and the way you deal with your inner demons like Batman, or is it about the love you project like Wonder Woman? And those themes, like Snyder, he's really good at identifying those themes. I will be the first to acknowledge that I'm not a big fan of how it's been executed. I wasn't a huge fan of metal. But, to answer your question, why I keep being drawn back, I will be drawn back to a story that does that, even if I don't like the ending, if I like the journey and how it challenges my thinking as I'm enjoying it. Because Snyder's Justice League, make no mistake, issue 25 of Justice League was one of the best comics I read in probably 10 years.
It was very good.
And so, I mean, I'm not going to judge a series based on, I can't judge a journey based on a destination, right? I mean, if I visited 39 places on a journey and the last place I visited sucked, that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy the previous 38.
See, here's the thing, and I'm obviously not going to disappoint, so I'm going to disagree with you. I think that, yes, while that is very specific to you, I don't think that most comic book readers think that way. And I will continue on without fear of generalizing, but speaking generally, I think that most comic book fans, man, they like the fucking sprinkles. They like the spectacle. They like the bright, shiny things. Because to be honest with you, I don't think many people that are giving metal a 10 are actively the ones looking for something thematically resonant with the world that we live in. I don't think they're the ones breaking down those things and finding those analogous things. I think they're looking at Wonder Woman with an invisible chainsaw and Batman with a Black Lantern ring. And I think that they're copping stiffies like prematurely. And to be honest with you, and it's clearly not how I like to approach comic book stories, and it's clearly not how you like to, but I don't think most people are reading comics for the themes. There certainly are people who are doing it. There's you, there's me. There are others who are sitting here joining us in the chat right now, but a majority of comic book fans like the bells and whistles. And it doesn't matter what the bells and whistles are on. It could be a Mustang, it could be a bicycle. But as long as the bells and whistles are there, I think it gets somebody to sit down on the vehicle and give it a go. So while unfortunate, while I wish it were different, I do honestly believe that you are just looking for something more out of something like death metal than what most people are. And with what death metal provides, the spectacle, the sprinkles, the bells and whistles, I think that that's why so many people are satisfied with it, because that's all they're looking for.
Well, I think that I think whether you're intending it or not, I think you're insulting the intelligence of people who read comics, because I think if you get to the heart and you, if you get to the heart, if you ask somebody why they like a comic book and you actually ask them questions like you and I ask each other questions that are quite in depth on individual comic books, it becomes quite clear very, very quickly that you and I see, that we have very specific reasons why we enjoy comics, and everybody is like that. And I don't think people are surface level. I think that the best stories are the ones that do speak to people on some level. And I think that's just the way it is. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, we could sit here and, I mean, obviously, yeah, for the hype, Wonder Woman with a chainsaw is the hype. Batman on a variant cover, stringing a guitar, playing a heavy metal guitar, that's hype. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with something in the story that keeps the readers fascinated there, and that ultimately it determines whether it's any good.
I mean, sure, that'll determine whether it's good, but I honestly, I'll maintain my disagreement. I don't think that that's what pulls in most people. I really do believe that most people are reading it for the cherry on top. Because if you were to read metal for anything in depth, you'd realize, again, you're being beaten over the head with the things that are supposed to be nuanced. So
you're saying, though, that you're saying that not only is comic book event hype not dead, you're saying that the hype is really all the fans care about, because they're too stupid. They're just staring at the sprinkles and the cherry. They don't care what the ice cream, if it's chocolate or vanilla. They don't care what's in the dessert, what the dessert is. As long as the sprinkles are there and the cherry's on top, they're going to eat it, because it's all about the hype. So the hype ain't dead, and that's all that matters. That's what I'm hearing you say.
I think they're definitely going to take a bite out of it, and they'll keep going until they realize that it's not a sundae and that it's just the bells and whistles. That's the thing, is that it's not, I mean, everybody reads comics and everybody experiences art and entertainment for very different things. So some people do want that. It's the same reason why you have crazy action movies that sometimes have no substance, that do very well, that are considered some of the greatest instances of cinema of all time. People look for different things in storytelling. And while I don't mean that as a way to demean anybody, I do think that that's what a lot of comic book readers are looking for. I mean, I think it's evident by the fact that, generally speaking, the populace does not look at the comic book medium as something on par with film, as something on par with prose or poetry, even though it is equally as capable. I make the claim that, for example, comic books are not often regarded or reviewed or talked about in the same manner, and they should be. And I think that that is an issue that comic books actually perpetuate. That's the problem. That, I mean, to me, that is something that I've always been deeply insulted by as a comic book fan, because although I wish it weren't true, I see it being true. I go into comic book groups, and the first question is always, who wins? This person, this is this person. It's always, this big spectacle that doesn't really matter to me, but it ultimately has no implication on the characters, on the worlds, on the story, on the themes, anything but who wins, Thanos or Darkseid? Who wins, Batman or Moonlight? Dog, who fucking cares? And honestly, like, that I think is one of the main reasons why people look down on comics and why it's not given the same credibility. You don't go to a big news site and get the same type of review for a comic book that you're going to get for a film or for a book. People don't put respect on comics' name. And it's not just because they fail to acknowledge certain things. It is because, frankly, it becomes difficult to acknowledge things when it becomes all about the sprinkles and the cherries and the whistles. Now, comics are for everybody. People can read and take out what they want to take out from it, but I completely stand by what I'm saying here. I do genuinely believe that the bells and the whistles are enough to get people on board for things. And some people jump off in the middle, but they catch you with the FOMO. They catch you with the fear of missing out. They catch you again with the shiny things. And it's very natural. Smart people get caught with shiny things. How many geniuses are out there with 12 different wives because this wife looks better in this dress and this wife looks better in this dress? Everybody does it. It's not a commentary on how intelligent or how capable they are of making decisions, but ultimately it's a thing. Like, it's right there and it's in big, bold red print. Like, when is the last time we had a super artistically told comic book that sold superbly well? Tell me. I'd like to know, because most of the comics that I honestly find myself enjoying from a storytelling, narrative, visual perspective are the ones that nobody is buying. The bells and whistles sell it. You brought up, for example, Hawkman. That's been a pretty consistently good book. Does that book sell? Absolutely fucking not. Because it's not the bells and whistles. It's not the fucking hair metal and the power chords and the crisis energy. It's just a good fucking book. And that's a problem. I mean, it's a persisting issue. So, I mean, whether somebody wants to take that as an insult or not, that's on them. Because quite frankly, I don't care. I'm into comics as an art form, as something that is capable of doing things that other art forms can and that other art forms cannot. And for my money, the best era in comics we have ever had is the Vertigo era in the late 1980s leading into that, because it revolutionized what we know comic books to be capable of. And the issue is that the general creator base is not taking advantage of it. When you have somebody like me who knows little to dib shit about comic books and I can pick apart your comic book, I genuinely think that's a problem. I really do.
Well, I mean, the only look at the end of the day, a story is either going to resonate or it's not. And, I do think that, because we're talking about death metal, which has in many ways come off like 6 or 7 other series, it is probably something that I don't ever want to see that repeated, because I don't think, I don't want to see that repeated. I'm just saying, that I didn't, it wasn't a terrible ride, but I would prefer it not be repeated. I agree that moving forward, like Jonathan Hickman, for example, has told a lot of long stories, but he did it independently. He went and he did his East of West. I mean, that's like, I think that's 39, 48 issues long. He's got his long narratives himself that if he would have went to Marvel and used up 5 or 6 titles to say that, he'd have fans pissed off at him, no matter how good the story was too, I think. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that this has taken up so much narrative territory in DC. And I think that's taken away from the story in itself, and trying to shoehorn in everything to continuity has been a problem. And I think it takes away from the creative juices that the writer has as well. So, and I think that's another fault of big events, is that I think it can put undue pressure on writers, quite frankly. I still think that Nick Spencer is a great writer. I think he was under a lot of pressure with Secret Empire, and I thought he did a decent job of it. But I think I just think that it's not fair to put all that pressure on one writer. Like Secret Empire, Nick Spencer's a prime example. Now, even Snyder to a certain extent with death metal, I mean, coming off the drama of the editorial woes of DC, I mean, it's just, everything's cumulative. So just like when I talked earlier about when we separated the structure, the scope of the story and from the marketing of an event, I think it's important that when we talk about big events, we have to separate sometimes the writer from the editorial drama, and there's other things that are going on behind the scenes. I know, for example, that Steve Orlando, he finished his Wonder Woman run 757, and it ended with the 4 horsemen. There weren't 4 horsewomen of Apocalypse. There was only 3, and it ended literally with Phantom Stranger showing up and turning War Master to stone, and that was how it ended. And Wonder Woman was about to forgive War Master. She was supposed to be a member of it was supposed to be this big epic battle, and it ended up being really nothing. It was sort of a Deus Ex Machina ending. Phantom Stranger is supposed to be a member of the Quintessence, and yet, he's suddenly in Wonder Woman now. But then I also know that Steve Orlando was kept in the dark about 5G, was kept in the dark what was going on at DC editorial. He ends up at Marvel. He had to do what he had. I know that he didn't have much choice. I know he did the best he could at what he had to work with. Steve Orlando hasn't made excuses, but I just use that as an example that he'll fall upon his sword when he knows his story could be better. And I know he's acknowledged that with Wonder Woman 757. I know that through a number of sources. But, I think that, we can't forget that there's more stuff going on behind the scenes here. You and I will, at this point, disagree on at least the appealability of death metal #1, but I can't say that I'm necessarily in disagreement with the essence of what you're saying. It's just a question of, we can disagree on which events resonated with us as opposed to others.
Well, that's what it comes down to, is that, I mean, as much as you and I think both tend to be 2 very, very critical kind of pundits of comic books, we are also looking for 2 very different things, right? Like, you are reading comic books as a longtime fan. I am reading comic books as somebody who wants to learn from them. And when I feel like there's nothing to learn from, that's when I go apeshit. You want your heroes to turn out the way you want them because you've been reading them since, who knows how long. We want different things out of it, and that's fine. But the issue is really, I mean, just bringing the examples of Snyder and Orlando. First of all, when's the last time Orlando wrote a tight story to begin with? I mean, I give him credit for being honest about this, but when's the last time he actually wrote a tight story from start to finish? Anyways, with Scott Snyder, and even if we're giving Orlando's some credibility about what he was and wasn't able to do in his run because of editorial constraints, Scott Snyder is at a point where he clearly does not have to answer to anybody. So when he's given a situation, when he is given complete and total agency over the product that he is selling to us in the form of the story, and it's still a mess, that is on him. It'd be very different if there were some very, very clear editorial pullbacks, but they're letting him do what he wants to do. That's why I won't take any of the blame off of him, because he's a competent enough writer. He is talented enough to know when he is not doing his best work, when he is not crossing his T's and dotting his I's, and especially when he is given that control, and when editors are likely afraid for their jobs to step up and give him pushback, then that's on him to take a step back from his own work and say, okay, maybe this doesn't add up, or okay, maybe we need to kind of tie these plot points together a little bit more thoroughly. And on a separate note, I did want to address Paul Baker's comment here on the chat, is that he feels like that Scott Snyder can feel the fun that Scott Snyder is having writing Metal, but his attempts at depth just tend to fall flat because he's not writing the characters, he's writing his action figures. And I agree. I think that he's kind of writing these weird caricatures of a lot of these iconic characters. And while some of them tend to be a little bit more accurate than others, generally speaking, I don't think it works well. Like spoilers for Death Metal, there's a very long Wally West monologue. And throughout reading that, I'm like, this is all by circumstance. This isn't Wally West talking. This is like literally like Dr. Manhattan's exposed penis talking right now. What's the deal? Because that's not Wally. It's whatever you need him to be. And while, yes, I agree, you can totally tell that Scott Snyder wants to have fun. I mean, he doesn't stop talking about how much fun he wants to have with Metal. It doesn't make it good. Like, again, bells and whistles doesn't make a functional bike. You still need, I'm not even going to try to dissect a bike because I don't really know shit about a bike, but I know bells and whistles don't make a bike. So,
well, I gotta say, if I was 10 years old again reading Death Metal #1, I would have a geekasm. Good Lord. I mean, Chainsaws of Truth, the Batman with the Black Lantern ring. I mean, all these new Bat characters. I mean, Superman's confected with the anti-life. I mean, all these things are happening. So many cool things, the stuff with Castle Bat and Mr. Miracle and the Demon and all these characters, Batmage and just everything. There's so much there to unpack that if it is fun and you can have a lot of fun with it. I agree that if it would be nice. Well, as a matter of fact, as a quick aside, it's one of the reasons why Scott Snyder's Undiscovered Country with Charles Soule, the reason why that is actually a reasonably good story so far at the first 6 issues is that Snyder brings his bizarre plot narratives into it, but Charles Soule grounds the story and gets us to know the characters better. So they're actually a good combination. And that's why I liked Undiscovered Country, because what the deficiencies of Snyder's writing, because I agree that his Snyder can't quite always nail those personal moments as well as some writers can. And but when you're having so much fun, you can be a little bit forgiving of that. And in any event, it is what it is. I mean, it's going to sell a lot of action figures. It's still going to sell a lot of comics, but he is who he is, and it makes for an eclectic, interesting mix, particularly when you combine Snyder with Charles Soule. And I would encourage people to read Undiscovered Country because it it actually is an interesting combination of two writers. And you can see Snyder's biases because they take turns writing the letters page at the end. They go back and forth. Charles Soule writes one issue and then Snyder writes another, and they talk about their experiences during the pandemic and what they're writing. And Snyder is definitely horror centric. He's a bizarre kind of thinker. Snyder thinks differently. He's always thinking about obscure, bizarre. He always has more of a horror element, more of a darker take, always a bizarre sort of way of looking at things. And Charles Soule is a lot more logical orientated. He's a little bit more grounded in his characters, and it makes for an interesting combination.
So you're telling me I have to force myself through the rest of issue 1 of Undiscovered Country? Because I got halfway through that bad boy and did not want to finish it.
Are you referring to my comments or Paul Baker's?
Yours. I was like, because I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but I started reading Undiscovered Country and stopped so many times because of how blatantly bad the dialogue was. But I don't know. That's me. Most people don't read comics for dialogue. So,
well, what turned me off, I'll be honest, what turned me off with Undiscovered Country are Scott Snyder's elements, because they get well, I'm assuming they're Scott Snyder's elements because the basic premise of the United States being cut off they cut themselves off from the rest of the world, but then the rest of the world has a virus, and then somebody within the United States that's surrounded by a wall says, "We found a cure. If you want to come and get it." They go into the United States. They send a secret team into the United States, but inside the wall, only to discover that the United States is, there's a bunch of bizarre creatures, and it's like a dystopian place. And you just know that Snyder wrote that part of it. And then when it picks up, when you get to know the characters and when you get past all the crazy looking creatures and you actually get some human beings and but you hit the third or fourth issue, it actually gets kind of interesting. And then there's a little time travel quirk to it. And I know Charles Soule has written a time travel novel, and I just know that the elements I like the most, I'm almost positive are Charles Soule's influence, to be honest with you, because I'm not a big fan of the bizarre creatures. I don't like the landscape of the Undiscovered Country.
See, I like the idea of the world building. I mean, for me, like I said, I've literally stopped reading at the same points of Undiscovered Country multiple. I've picked up the first issue 3 times and tried to get myself through it. And I just remember getting so floored by starting with that scene in the helicopter, and the entire main cast of characters are there. And like, first of all, Giuseppe Camuncoli can't draw faces to save his life because they all look like the back end of a donkey. But you can't make out half the characters, and then everybody has to refer to each other by first names because the dialogue bubbles and like the 3-dimensionality of that image is so bad that they all kind of look like they're kind of sitting on a flat surface. So it's hard to tell who's talking, and the only way to differentiate it is by them referring to each other in every single new bubble of dialogue. I don't know. I just from a technical writing standpoint, I just couldn't get past that. But I digress. I don't want to go too
Incidentally, far. I was gonna. Sorry.
I was just gonna say,
there. Sorry.
I just didn't want to go too far up that rabbit hole, or down that rabbit hole, I should say.
I was gonna say a quick digression on Dark Knight's Metal or Death Metal #1. Good Lord. You notice that the dialogue bubbles when the Batman Who Laughs speaks. I noticed that his dialogue is actually it's a larger font than it usually is. Because I mean, the criticism of his Batman Who Laughs series, the font was so small, but it's actually larger in this series. I find so it's easier to read.
See, as we're scaling down to the end of this episode, you brought up that page, and I mean, fuck it. Here's another rant for you. You know what really grinds my motherfucking gears?
You're gonna tell me, aren't you?
Oh, I'm gonna tell you how it's. And I love Greg Capullo, but it's like every time on Twitter, he's like, "Oh, I just spent this entire month drawing." First of all, Greg, you do like 6 issues a year. Calm the fuck down. And your background of all of your covers are straight black. So I know you're not spending your time. But you know what really fucking kills me? You pay for an oversized issue like that. So that page that you just pulled up, where it's just basically a cropped part of the cover to issue 1, but with a blue fucking dirty filter thrown over it. There are 3 pages like that in that book. 3 pages. One of them has the monologue. 2 of them have fucking nothing. And you're paying for those fucking pages while he is complaining about all of this extra work that he's doing throughout the year. You literally ripped me off for 3 pages, Greg. What is going on? Like that, I remember, oh man, I was so glad that I had a preview copy and that I didn't buy this, because I remember getting it. I was like, okay. It's like this one had his monologue. So I was like, okay, we're technically getting something. The next 2, straight nothing. You're not even drawing full issues, Greg. What's going on? What's taking so long? Because I sure as hell don't get it. I don't know, man. That really honestly kind of grinds my gears, because I do like Greg Capullo a lot, and he's a real stand-up guy. But when I see him on social media talking about all of this art that he's doing, when he only does like 6 issues a year, and half of the covers that he does are cop-outs because there's no background whatsoever, and then you get to this, the biggest book he's done since Metal, and we're getting fucked over on pages that we're paying for that are just cropped pieces of the first issue cover with some dusty ass blue filter on it. Rant over.
Yeah. No, that's good. But this seems like a good time to wrap it up here. I got to spend the time with the wife and the daughter now.
I agree. You don't want to give me another chance to rant about death metal. That's a very good call. I think we've said all the things we need to say. I just want to say hello to Tevye Smoko, who joins us.
Hey,
Tevye. He also says death metal is 10 times better than the awful event Leviathan garbage. Tevye, 10 times 0 is still 0, my friend. But with that being said, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Whether I apologize if you didn't enjoy the rants on death metal and the state of comic book events. If you did, I'm so glad you did, because there was plenty of that here. If you guys haven't already, make sure to leave a like down below if you enjoyed this video. You can also go check out the one and only ComicBoom using a link in the description below to his channel. He just put out his review of Death Metal #1 that you guys might want to check out, because I imagine it'll be immensely less depressing than mine, which is coming. So if you want that, there's that too. But with that being said, are there any other videos coming out on the horizon, Boom, that you want to let the folks know about to go check out on the channel?
I think I feel a rant coming on. I'm gonna rant. I'm gonna rant about maybe DC and Marvel a little bit, and I do my Wonder Woman review on the weekend, and then we also have Dark Knight. You and I are doing a podcast with Comic Source tomorrow, right?
Yes, on the channel. Another episode of Let's Talk Comics. We're doing a comic book State of the Union of sorts, following or as we climb out of this pandemic. So that should be a lot of fun. Same time, same bat time, same bat channel. So you guys can definitely look out for that. And I believe, I think we're still working out the details, but there will be an audio only version of it posted on his site, which you can find a link to in the description of that video if that interests you as well. So yeah, options. But make sure you guys go subscribe to Boom, one of the best comic book reviewers out there on the internet, no matter how wrong he can be sometimes. Steadily climbing to 1,000 subscribers, which is overly deserved at this point. So you guys go give him a look. And I just dropped my review to the Joker 80th anniversary spectacular with an option to win a copy for yourself. So click the link, go to the channel, watch that video, like it, dislike it, do whatever you feel like you want to do with it. Just watch it for me, please and thank you. But I want to thank you guys again so much for watching. Boom. Thanks for joining me again, and thanks for putting up with my rant.
All good.
But with all that out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you in another great episode of Let's Talk Comics here on the Dark Knight.